In a courtroom, a black woman judge faces silent prejudice from a police officer who doesn't recognize her authority. As their paths cross, both learn powerful lessons about bias, respect, and self-worth. This emotional journey challenges perceptions, proving that identity is built on strength, not the color of one's skin. Before we dive into this powerful story, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more inspiring and thought-provoking videos like this one. Your support helps us share impactful stories that matter. Now let's get started. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet anticipation as the judge's bench stood empty. Lawyers reviewed their notes. A few whispers passed between the audience, and the air was thick with the tension of an important trial. This was a place where careers were made or shattered, where the fate of people hung in the balance. The door at the front of the room creaked open, and all eyes turned toward the entryway. She walked in with a quiet confidence. Judge Ella. At 32, she was already one of the youngest judges in the state, and her reputation had spread far beyond the courtroom. But no matter how successful she had become, the moment she stepped into that courtroom, she could feel the weight of all that she had worked for. As Ella made her way to the bench, her heels clicked softly on the polished floor. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, but there was an undeniable intensity to the way she carried herself. Her dark skin glowed under the courtroom lights, and her long, neatly styled hair framed her face with a quiet dignity. She was dressed in the black robe that had become a symbol of her hard-earned position, but to many she was still just a woman of color in a role where people expected someone who looked very different. It wasn't easy, but she had earned her seat at the table, and in a world that still found it hard to accept her authority, she made sure to hold that seat with pride. For Ella, becoming a judge had always been a dream, but it was a dream she was told was almost impossible to reach. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, she had faced her share of obstacles. As a black woman, there were constant reminders that the world was not built for people like her to succeed, especially not in professions like law. But Ella had always been determined, not just to prove others wrong, but to prove to herself that she could be the change she wanted to see in the world. From a young age, Ella had a sharp mind, and her passion for justice was undeniable. She often found herself reading case studies, diving into debates, and questioning the fairness of decisions made in the courts. In school, she excelled academically, but she also knew that her achievements, no matter how stellar, were often overshadowed by her race. Teachers sometimes questioned her abilities. Classmate remarks were often tinted with bias, and job opportunities were scarce for someone who didn't fit the mold of a lawyer or judge. But Ella wasn't discouraged. She went to law school, faced the challenges of being one of the few black students, and worked harder than anyone to prove she belonged. Years of dedication, late-night studying, and difficult cases had gotten her to this point. Now, as she sat behind the bench, she felt a wave of gratitude, but it was quickly followed by the familiar tension in her chest. There was always that moment before the gavel came down, when the courtroom quieted, and she knew that no matter how much respect she had earned, there would always be some who doubted her just because of the color of her skin. But Judge Ella had learned not to let those doubts hold her back. She had faced racism head-on in her career, and every time she did, it only made her stronger. She was here now, and she would continue to show the world that being a judge had nothing to do with the color of your skin. It was about knowledge, experience, integrity, and she had all of that and more. With a deep breath, she took her seat, and the room fell into an attentive silence. Today was another day to prove what she had known all along. Her dream was no longer just a dream, it was a reality. The courtroom door creaked open with the faintest sound, drawing everyone's attention toward it. The shuffle of feet, the soft murmurs that had been floating in the room, all quieted as Officer Mark entered. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the crisp uniform of a police officer. His boots clicked loudly on the polished floor, and the room seemed to subconsciously adjust its energy to accommodate his presence. It was clear he was here on official business. Another day, another case to be handled. But little did he know, today would be different. Mark had been a police officer for almost 12 years. He'd seen it all: street brawls, high-speed chases, tense standoffs. But a courtroom? That was something else. It wasn't that he wasn't used to the formalities of the law. He had attended numerous hearings and had even given testimony in cases before. But today, he felt a strange weight in his chest as he walked into the room. It wasn't the usual nerves. No, this time, something was off. He was a seasoned officer, sure of himself. But this place was different. The air felt heavier, the silence more intense. His eyes scanned the room, looking for familiar faces, other officers, perhaps a few attorneys he knew. And that's when his gaze fell on the bench. At first, he didn't process it. His mind was still preoccupied with the case he was here to testify in. He shifted his attention to the courtroom staff, to the lawyers shuffling papers and the defendant's nervous glances. But then, as his gaze briefly flicked back to the bench, it stopped, frozen. There, sitting in front of the room, was the judge, a black woman. Mark's initial thought was almost immediate. How could a black woman be a judge? The thought flashed through his mind like a reflex, something he hadn't even meant to think. He immediately tried to brush it aside. It was a fleeting, almost unconscious judgment. But there it was, right in front of him. His eyes lingered on her for just a moment too long, noticing her dark skin, the poised yet relaxed way she sat behind the bench, as though she belonged there. And there was the subtle way her black robe draped perfectly across her shoulders, framing her slim figure in a dignified, authoritative way. She had the presence of someone who had earned that seat, not by luck, but by grit and determination. Still, Mark couldn't help but feel a shift in his perception. He was used to seeing judges with a certain look. Older, typically white men in well-tailored suits. That was the standard in his mind. And here, sitting before him, was someone who looked completely different from the judges he had encountered in his career so far. He knew better than to let thoughts like that cloud his judgment. But the truth was, it was hard to shake the instinctual bias that had been ingrained in him over years of being in law enforcement, a system that was still, in many ways, stuck in its old ways. And as much as he tried to convince himself it didn't matter, there was an undeniable shock in seeing her there. As Mark took his seat, he tried to focus on the case. He glanced down at the paperwork in front of him, scanning the charges. The defendant was a young man, accused of armed robbery. He'd seen similar cases before. This wasn't anything new. He could do this. He had done it 1,000 times. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the judge. Ella. She had a calm, almost serene expression, as though she had been in control of this room for years. She exuded confidence, but it wasn't an arrogance. No, it was something deeper, something quieter, an unspoken assurance that she belonged here. The way she handled herself, the way she commanded attention without raising her voice, was unlike anything Mark had seen before. A part of him felt unsettled. Why? Because she didn't fit the image he had in his mind of what a judge should be. His thoughts were a mess, disjointed as he tried to push away the nagging discomfort. He shifted in his seat, hoping the case would start soon to take his mind off this unexpected feeling. As the proceedings began, Mark noticed the way Ella conducted herself. She spoke with authority but also with an air of empathy. Her voice was steady, warm but firm when needed. She didn't need to shout or overemphasize her words to make people listen. The courtroom fell silent as she began, her presence filling the room like an invisible force. And yet, Mark couldn't stop himself from feeling a little uneasy. He caught himself once again. Why did he feel like this? What was wrong with him? He had been trained to look beyond race, beyond gender. But deep down, some part of him was still reacting in ways that he couldn't quite explain. As the case moved forward, Mark tried to focus, reminding himself that he was here to testify, not to judge the judge. His job was to present the facts, to stick to what he knew. But it wasn't just the case that was on his mind now. It was Ella, this judge. How had she gotten here? Did she deserve to be in this position? Was she capable? His first impression was clear. She didn't look like the judges he was used to. And though he had been taught to respect authority, a small voice inside his head questioned whether she truly had the authority to make decisions that could change people's lives. It was a question he didn't want to entertain, but it lingered at the back of his mind. The more he watched her, though, the more he realized something. Ella wasn't just filling a seat. She wasn't just there because it was a job. She had worked, fought, and endured in a system that wasn't built for her. And slowly, as the minutes ticked by, something inside Mark shifted. Something he didn't fully understand yet, but something that, deep down, was starting to change. And in that moment, Officer Mark had no idea that today, in this courtroom, he was about to be taught a lesson he would never forget. The courtroom was a place of rules, of fairness, or so it was supposed to be. But behind the official scripts, behind the rehearsed arguments and legal procedures, there was another world that lurked in the shadows, one of judgment, prejudice, and bias. And Judge Ella knew it all too well. As the case continued, she watched the subtle dynamics unfold around her. She could feel the dismissive glances, the whispers that barely reached her ears, but were loud enough for her to catch. The small, casual ways the lawyers and court staff seemed to underestimate her. These were not overt insults, but they were just as damaging. They were the silent cuts, the glances that lingered a little too long on her dark skin, the moments when someone failed to make eye contact with her, the polite nods that felt more like pity than respect. Today, one of the defense lawyers, a middle-aged man with a thick accent and a portfolio brimming with credentials, barely acknowledged her as he approached the bench. He spoke quickly, almost as if he didn't think she was worth his full attention. He didn't wait for her to finish speaking before he started reading from his notes, cutting her off in mid-sentence. It wasn't the first time she had experienced this. It wouldn't be the last. Ella remained composed, of course. That's what she had learned to do. But inside, the familiar sting of exclusion made her chest tighten. She had grown used to these moments, even if they still cut deep. She had worked tirelessly to get here, to prove that her intellect, her ability to make the right decisions, had nothing to do with the color of her skin or her gender. But no matter how many cases she handled, no matter how many cases she won, there were always those who still saw her as an outsider. She saw it in the small details, like how the other attorneys would address her. She was constantly Ms. Ella or Judge, but they never called her Your Honor with the same level of respect they would give a white male judge. There was always a subtle hesitation, a slight gap between acknowledging her authority and fully accepting it. It was as though she had to prove every day that she deserved to be there. Even the court staff, clerks, bailiffs, and security officers, who were typically more neutral in their demeanor, sometimes treated her with a certain distance. Ella couldn't help but notice how, when she entered the courtroom, some would exchange small, almost imperceptible glances. The way they deferred to the white male lawyers, or the way they seemed to give them more leeway during proceedings. It was all so quiet, but it never escaped her notice. Ella had learned early on to keep her emotions in check. She had learned that if she showed any signs of frustration, if she allowed even a hint of weakness to show, it would be taken as proof of her inferiority. They were waiting for her to make a mistake, to lose control. Every time she walked into that courtroom, she was aware that her every move was being scrutinized, not just as a judge, but as a woman of color in a seat of power. It wasn't just about the cases she ruled on. It was about whether or not she could prove, once again, that she had earned her place. Despite all her qualifications, despite her years of schooling, the endless hours spent preparing for trials, the sacrifices she had made to rise through the ranks, there were still those who couldn't accept that she had made it this far. And it wasn't just the people who openly showed their bias. The worst kind of prejudice was the quiet, institutionalized one, the kind that lingered in the systems, the unspoken assumptions that no one acknowledged but everyone felt. Ella's mind drifted back to her first years on the bench. Those early days were the hardest. She was often the only black woman in the courtroom. The whispers were louder then. The subtle glances were sharper. She had been younger, less experienced, and perhaps most importantly, she hadn't yet built the confidence she had now. It was a constant battle. In the beginning, she had second-guessed herself, wondered if she truly belonged. Did her decisions carry the same weight as those made by the older white male judges who'd been in the system for decades? But over time, she learned how to silence those doubts. She learned that her value wasn't defined by anyone else's perception of her. Her ability to judge, to make decisions, wasn't based on her race or her gender. It was about her intellect, her judgment, and her ability to look at every case with impartiality and fairness. She had earned this. Still, the inner struggle didn't stop. On days like today, when the bias was so palpable, when the dismissiveness of others crept under her skin, the fight was harder. She had to remind herself that this was part of the journey. It wasn't easy, but she was stronger than ever. Each microaggression, each moment of being underestimated, fueled her resolve. A quiet part of her, though she would never admit it aloud, longed for the day when her race and gender would no longer be points of conversation, when she would simply be seen as Judge Ella and nothing more. But she also knew that was a distant dream. The world was not yet ready to fully embrace the idea of a black woman in authority, especially in a position as powerful as hers. For now, she had to keep pushing forward. She had to keep proving herself, not because she was any less capable than her colleagues, but because the world still had its doubts. As the defense lawyer finished his argument, Ella sat back, her fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the bench. The weight of the room pressed against her, but she didn't let it show. She had work to do, and she would do it with the same grace, dignity, and strength she had always shown. Even if the world wasn't ready to acknowledge it, Ella knew one thing for sure. She deserved to be here, just as much as anyone else. The morning sun filtered through the high courtroom windows, casting long beams of light that bathed the room in a soft, golden hue. The case had only just begun, but already tensions were high. The defendant, a young man named Thomas Harris, sat hunched over at the defendant's table, looking nervous. His eyes darted between the lawyers, the jurors, and Judge Ella, who sat firmly at the bench, watching over the proceedings with calm precision. Officer Mark, who had been assigned to testify, stood at the front of the courtroom, awaiting his turn. He was an experienced officer, but today something felt different. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a weight that seemed to make the walls of the room press in on him. He had testified in countless cases before, and he was confident in his ability to give a clear and compelling account of events. But something about this case felt personal, and he couldn't quite shake the uneasy feeling that something was at stake beyond just the outcome. As the defense attorney began his cross-examination, Mark's focus shifted. He was intent on winning, on proving that Thomas was guilty, that the events unfolded just as he had reported them. He wasn't about to let the defense pull any tricks. His mind was laser-focused on presenting his side of the story, ensuring that the truth would come out. But what he didn't anticipate was the quiet power that Judge Ella exuded in the courtroom. Throughout the entire trial, she had conducted herself with unwavering authority, responding to objections with calm precision, keeping the flow of the case intact. Mark couldn't deny that she was competent, but there was something in the back of his mind that whispered doubts. Subtle doubts, the kind he couldn't quite shake. He couldn't stop himself from thinking that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't be as tough as a white male judge would be. After all, there were still many who believed a woman of color might be too emotional or soft to make tough decisions. It was during a brief lull in the trial, as the defense lawyer questioned the credibility of Mark's testimony, that Mark made his mistake. The defense attorney, with his calm demeanor and carefully chosen words, challenged Mark's recollection of events, casting doubt on the officer's account. Mark stood firm, his arms crossed, trying to stay composed as the defense lawyer poked holes in his version of the story. But when the lawyer made one final point about the circumstances surrounding Thomas's arrest, Mark felt his patience thinning. His pride was at stake. He couldn't let this go unchallenged. In a moment of frustration, Mark turned to Judge Ella. His tone, though polite, carried an edge of dismissiveness. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, the words almost dripping with a sense of superiority, "this line of questioning is irrelevant. We're here to determine the facts, not to waste time on trivialities. I'm just trying to make sure we're staying focused on the real issue here." The words fell into the courtroom like a sudden tension. Everyone went still, eyes darting between Mark and Judge Ella. The defense attorney raised an eyebrow, while the jurors leaned in slightly. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, unsure of what would happen next. But it was Judge Ella's reaction that everyone was waiting for. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. She simply regarded Mark with a steady, calm gaze. Her expression was composed, her eyes unwavering. It wasn't anger or frustration that crossed her face. It was something more deliberate, a recognition that this moment was a test, not just of Mark's character, but of his perception of her. Slowly, she sat up straighter in her chair, adjusting her robe, and then spoke in her measured, calm voice. "Officer Mark," she began, her words deliberate, carrying a weight that echoed in the silent courtroom. "I want to remind you and everyone in this room that I am the judge here. I have earned this position through years of hard work and dedication, not because of my race nor my gender, but because of my qualifications and my ability to administer justice impartially. When I ask questions, when I make rulings, it is not a matter of wasting time. It is a matter of ensuring that this trial is conducted fairly for both sides. I do not need your permission to focus on the facts of the case." There was a pause, just long enough for her words to sink in. Mark's face reddened slightly, but he held his ground, shifting uncomfortably on his feet. The tension in the room was palpable, as the court's attention seemed to hang in the air, waiting for him to respond. Ella continued, her voice unwavering. "I understand that this is a high-stakes case, officer, and I appreciate your desire to see justice done. But I must remind you that your opinion of the proceedings does not supersede my responsibility to maintain order in this courtroom and to ensure that all sides are heard fairly. I will make my decisions based on the facts, not on assumptions or biases." Her words were firm, yet measured. She didn't raise her voice, but the authority in her tone left no room for doubt. Mark stood there, momentarily stunned. The courtroom felt as though time had stopped. The words she had spoken were not just directed at him. They were a reminder to everyone in the room that Ella's role as judge was not up for negotiation. It was not something to be dismissed or undermined. It was hers by merit, by the very nature of her hard work, and by the authority granted to her by the law. For the first time since he had walked into the courtroom that day, Mark's assumptions began to crack. He had thought that because of her race and gender, Ella would be more likely to back down, to compromise in ways a more traditional judge might not. But the quiet power of her words shattered those assumptions. She was unyielding. She was determined. And she commanded respect, not because of the color of her skin or her gender, but because of the role she held and the experience she brought with her. As the silence stretched out, Mark felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected her to be so steadfast, so unwavering in her position. But as the minutes passed, a small voice inside him began to stir. It was the voice of someone who had always been so sure of his own biases, who had never had to challenge the assumptions he carried with him. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about him. It was about how he had misjudged her, how he had underestimated her based on his own prejudices. Ella didn't wait for Mark to respond. Instead, she turned her attention back to the defense lawyer, who was now cautiously nodding. "Proceed with your questioning, counselor," she said, her voice steady. Mark felt a small lump form in his throat. His mistake, however unintentional, had been laid bare. And for the first time, he was forced to confront the biases that had lingered, unspoken, in his mind. The courtroom drama continued, but for Mark, something fundamental had shifted. The fog of his preconceived notions had begun to clear. He had been given a wake-up call, a reminder that authority, respect, and competence were not determined by race, gender, or appearance. They were earned through integrity, hard work, and the ability to stand firm, just as Judge Ella had. As the case unfolded, Mark couldn't help but watch her more closely. This wasn't just a judge he was dealing with. It was someone who had earned her place, who had proven herself time and time again. And in that moment, Mark realized that the real trial wasn't just about the facts of the case. It was about confronting his own biases and the way he had underestimated Ella, simply because of who she was. The days passed in the courtroom, but for Officer Mark, something inside him had shifted. The realization had been slow, a quiet unfolding of truth that he couldn't ignore. Ella wasn't just another judge. She wasn't some token representation of diversity who had somehow slipped through the cracks. No, she was sharp, intelligent, and undeniably capable. Her decisions were precise, her words measured, and her ability to command the room with nothing more than a calm presence was something Mark couldn't deny. Every motion she made, every ruling she issued seemed to carry the weight of experience. She wasn't here by chance. She wasn't filling a seat just because of her race or gender. She had earned her place through years of dedication, study, and grit. As the case wore on, Mark found himself watching her more closely. He observed how she handled objections with quiet authority, how she managed difficult witnesses with ease, and how she kept the courtroom under control, even when emotions flared. He saw the way she didn't flinch when the defense lawyer tried to undermine her decisions, the way she remained steady when the pressure was on. There was a quiet strength in her, an unwavering conviction that her role wasn't just a title, it was something she had earned and fought for every single day. With each passing moment, Mark began to question his own assumptions. When he first walked into the courtroom, he had subconsciously expected her to be like the other judges he had seen in his career, white, male, older. He hadn't thought she was capable, not in the same way. He had thought, in the back of his mind, that maybe she wasn't quite up to the job, that maybe, because of her race and gender, she would be swayed by emotions, or lack the fortitude that came with years of experience in the justice system. But he had been wrong. Ella wasn't just doing her job, she was excelling at it. She was proving him, and everyone else who doubted her, wrong. She was handling the case with the kind of poise and skill that Mark had only ever seen from the most seasoned judges. The reality was hard for him to admit, but it was there, undeniable. Mark could feel the discomfort rising inside him as he realized the full extent of his bias. It wasn't just that he had underestimated Ella, it was that he had thought less of her because of things beyond her control. Her race, her gender. Those were the factors he had allowed to cloud his judgment. And as the evidence piled up, as the arguments played out with clarity, he couldn't ignore the unfairness of his initial thoughts. His mind began to churn, reflecting on moments from his past, times when he had unconsciously dismissed others based on superficial assumptions. How many times had he assumed things about people, about their abilities, their worth, based on race or gender or appearance? How many times had he given more weight to someone's words simply because they looked the part, because they fit the profile of what he expected? And how many times had he done the opposite to people like Ella? His heart sank a little as he realized the depth of his own prejudices, the silent ones, the ones he had never even thought to confront. But now, in the face of Ella's competence, those biases were being exposed, and he couldn't look away. Ella, for her part, was unaware of the internal battle Mark was facing. She was focused, as always, on the task at hand. She had long since learned that the weight of others' judgments wasn't her burden to carry. She had spent years working in a system that wasn't designed for her, working against biases and expectations that told her she didn't belong. And yet, here she was, doing her job with confidence, with grace, and with the kind of quiet power that came from knowing her own worth. Her strength wasn't something she needed to prove. It had been validated long ago. Every day, every decision she made was a testament to her capability. But it was moments like this, when someone like Mark, who had been so dismissive of her, began to realize her worth, that reminded her of the power she held. She was an example of resilience, of the ability to rise above the limitations others tried to place on her. She wasn't just a judge, she was a woman of color who had fought for everything she had, and every single time she stepped into that courtroom, she proved that she belonged there. Ella knew the struggle that came with being underestimated. She knew what it felt like to have others question her ability, to feel the weight of their doubts and biases. But she also knew the quiet joy that came with standing tall in the face of that adversity, with proving, not to others, but to herself, that she was more than capable. She had earned this seat at the bench, and no one, no matter how high their position or how deeply ingrained their prejudices, could take that from her. As the case neared its conclusion, Mark found himself thinking less about winning. He wasn't as focused on the outcome as he had been when the trial first began. Instead, he found himself reflecting on the larger picture. His eyes would drift to Ella, watching her calmly deliberate over a motion or listening intently to a witness's testimony. And slowly, as he watched her in action, the realization hit him harder and harder. It wasn't her race. It wasn't her gender. It was her competence, her intelligence, her experience, and the quiet strength that came with every decision she made. He began to see her as more than just a woman of color on the bench. He saw her for who she really was, an incredibly capable judge, a force to be reckoned with. And in that moment, Mark began to see the unfairness of his initial judgment for what it was. It wasn't just wrong. It was rooted in something deeper, something ingrained in him without his even realizing it. He wasn't just learning about the law in that courtroom. He was learning about himself. As the case came to a close, Mark found himself with a newfound respect for Ella. It wasn't just the legal decisions she had made, though they had been sound and fair. It was the way she had handled the entire process, her calm demeanor, her unwavering authority, her ability to stand strong despite the biases she faced every day. She had been a shining example of resilience. Ella, too, could feel the shift. She had known from the start that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be people who doubted her, who saw her as less than. But as she looked out across the courtroom, she could feel the weight of the respect that had slowly built for her, from Mark and from everyone in the room. It was a silent acknowledgement, but it was there. And it was enough. She knew that, in this moment, she had not only won the case, but had made a lasting impact. For Mark, the lesson was clear. It wasn't just about justice in the courtroom. It was about fighting against the prejudices we all carry, and the importance of seeing people for who they truly are, not for the assumptions we place on them. The case was over, and the courtroom had emptied, leaving only a few scattered papers and the faint hum of the air conditioning. Mark lingered by the exit, watching as Judge Ella collected her papers and prepared to leave. His mind was a swirl of conflicting thoughts, feelings of shame, regret, and confusion, mixed with a deep sense of gratitude for the lesson he had unknowingly received. As Mark walked through the halls of the courthouse, his thoughts kept returning to Ella's calm, firm response in the courtroom. Her words echoed in his mind. "I am the judge here. I do not need your permission to focus on the facts of the case." He couldn't shake the truth in them. He had underestimated her, dismissed her based on assumptions he hadn't even realized he was making. And the truth was, he had been wrong. Not just in that moment, but in countless others throughout his life. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, fair, tough when he needed to be, protective of justice. But now he began to question whether he had been as impartial as he thought. How many times had he carried unconscious biases into his decisions? How many times had he looked at people, whether in the courtroom, on the street, or in his personal life, and made assumptions based on their race, their background, their appearance? How many times had he failed to see the real person behind the stereotype? The realization hit him hard. The weight of his own ignorance felt like a burden he wasn't sure how to carry. He knew it wasn't enough to just acknowledge his mistake. It wasn't enough to just feel bad about it. Mark understood now that change had to come from within. He had to confront his own biases, question them, and actively work to undo the damage they had caused. As he stood there, lost in thought, he saw Judge Ella one last time. She was gathering her coat, and for a moment, their eyes met. There was no judgment in her gaze, no sign that she had noticed the transformation he was going through. To her, the case was just another day, another step in a long, difficult journey of proving that she belonged. But to Mark, it was something far more profound. "Judge Ella," he called out softly, almost as if he wasn't sure what he was about to say. She paused and turned toward him, waiting. I wanted to apologize for how I acted, for my assumptions. I was wrong." Ella regarded him silently for a moment. She had no reason to forgive him, no obligation to ease his guilt. But something in her softened when she saw the sincerity in his eyes. She nodded just once and spoke quietly. "I appreciate that, Officer Mark. But it's not about what I think of you. It's about what you think of yourself and how you choose to move forward." Her words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. It wasn't the apology that mattered. It was the lesson behind it. As Mark left the courthouse, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that he could start questioning the way he viewed the world. He could begin to look beyond the surface, beyond the assumptions, and focus on the humanity of each individual. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but it was a start. The next day, in the courtroom, Judge Ella delivered the final ruling in the case, but it was her parting words that carried the greatest weight. She stood up from the bench and addressed the room, a room that had witnessed the transformation of Officer Mark and perhaps the quiet shift of others as well. "Before we end today's session," Judge Ella began, her voice firm yet gentle, "I'd like to leave you with a thought." She paused, letting the room settle. All eyes were on her. Who we are is not defined by the color of our skin, but by our hard work, compassion, and what we stand for. We are more than our outward appearance. We are defined by our actions, our values, and our ability to show kindness and understanding, even in the face of adversity. Her words hung in the air, resonating with everyone present. They weren't just a message for Mark. They were a reminder for everyone in that room. They were a call to break free from the invisible walls built by prejudice and bias, to see the truth of people for who they really were, to reject stereotypes and embrace the deeper qualities that defined each person. Mark, who had been standing at the back of the room, felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't the only one who had learned something today. The lesson had rippled through the courtroom, leaving an impression on everyone. He could see it in the way the other officers carried themselves, the way the lawyers seemed to pause, reflecting on her words. He could see the jurors nodding, as if something deep inside them was shifting as well. As the case ended and people filed out, Mark caught sight of Ella one more time. She was standing in the hallway, speaking briefly with the clerk. He walked up to her, this time with no shame, only a genuine desire to speak. "I just want to thank you," Mark said quietly, "for everything, for teaching me something that I didn't even know I needed to learn. I'm going to work on being better." Ella sonrió suavemente, pero no había orgullo en su sonrisa. No need for praise. She had heard this kind of promise before. "It's not about being better in a moment," she said. "It's about being better every day, one step at a time." And with that, she walked away, leaving Mark with a profound sense of hope. He understood now. Change didn't have to be dramatic. It didn't need to be a sudden grand gesture. It was about small, everyday choices, the willingness to see beyond the surface and truly look at people for who they were, not what they appeared to be. And as he walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon, Mark knew that he was on a new path. One where he would try every day to challenge his assumptions, his prejudices, and to see others with a new clarity. It wasn't just a hopeful ending. It was the beginning of something new, for him, for Ella, and for everyone who had learned that day that change, though slow, was always possible.